this episode, we take a big step from planning and documentation into the practical reality of doing the work the same way every time, which is what consistent implementation really means. A compliance baseline is not just a list of controls you once selected and then filed away, because the baseline is supposed to produce predictable protection outcomes across the system's life. Consistency is the difference between a control that exists as a one-time setup and a control that survives new hires, system changes, vendor updates, and the normal chaos of day-to-day operations. For brand new learners, the most common surprise is that inconsistency usually does not look like someone turning security off on purpose. It looks like small variations across environments, different teams interpreting the same requirement differently, or a rush change that bypasses a step that everyone assumed was optional. The goal here is to help you understand how to implement controls so they remain aligned with the chosen baseline, not only in theory, but as a durable routine that keeps the compliance story true. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong way to begin is to separate the baseline from the implementation, because beginners sometimes assume the baseline is the implementation. The baseline is the requirement set, meaning what outcomes and behaviors must exist for this category of system based on the chosen framework's rules. Implementation is the collection of mechanisms and routines that make those outcomes real, like access approvals that happen before access is granted, logging that actually captures events and is reviewed, and configuration settings that remain hardened after updates. Consistency means those mechanisms and routines are applied with the same intent and the same parameters across the scope you defined, even when the system grows or changes. When a baseline says access must be restricted, it does not mean restricted only for the parts that are easy to lock down. When a baseline expects review, it does not mean review when someone remembers. Implementing consistently means you treat the baseline as a standard that must be met repeatedly, not as a one-time project deliverable. Once you internalize that, you start designing controls to be repeatable instead of impressive. A good baseline-aligned implementation also depends on having clear control parameters and not letting them drift into vague language during build-out. If you documented that access reviews happen quarterly, then quarterly is a requirement, not a suggestion, and the implementation must make quarterly reviews easy to perform and hard to forget. If you documented that logs are retained for a defined period, then retention must be enforced, not left to chance or manual cleanup. If you documented that vulnerabilities are triaged and remediated within defined timeframes, then the workflow must actually track time and escalate overdue issues. Consistency is often lost when teams implement the general idea but ignore the parameters that make it testable, because those parameters feel like paperwork rather than real protection. In reality, parameters are what turns a general security goal into a measurable control. When parameters are implemented consistently, evidence becomes straightforward because the system's behavior matches the documented intent. One of the most common causes of inconsistency is differences between environments, such as production versus development versus testing, and you have to handle those differences explicitly. Some systems genuinely have different risk profiles across environments, and frameworks often allow reasonable differences, but those differences must be deliberate, documented, and still aligned with baseline intent. A dangerous pattern is when production is hardened but non-production quietly becomes a shortcut zone where sensitive information types are copied, credentials are shared, and logging is minimal. Even if non-production is considered lower risk, it can become an attacker's easiest path into production if identities, code, or network connections overlap. Consistent implementation means you define which baseline expectations apply across all environments, such as access discipline and credential handling, and which expectations are scoped differently with justification, such as availability requirements that might be stricter in production. This is not about treating everything as identical. It is about preventing accidental exceptions that undermine the baseline. The more clearly you define environment rules, the less likely drift becomes. Consistency also depends on the idea of standard patterns, which means you implement controls using repeatable methods rather than custom one-offs. If every application team invents its own way to do access approvals, it becomes nearly impossible to prove consistent compliance, and it becomes nearly impossible to maintain when people change roles. A baseline-aligned approach tends to use shared services and common controls whenever possible, because shared capabilities create consistent enforcement and consistent evidence. For example, if authentication is provided centrally and your system uses it for all user populations and scope, you have a consistent enforcement point rather than multiple independent ones. If logging is collected and retained centrally and your system sends the right events, you gain consistent retention and consistent protection. The same logic applies to vulnerability tracking and incident response routing, where standard workflows help the organization prove that controls are not ad hoc. Standard patterns are not about convenience only. They are a compliance strength because they reduce variability, and variability is where control failures hide. Another place inconsistency shows up is in role and responsibility confusion, especially when controls are partly inherited or depend on shared services. A system team might assume a platform team handles logging reviews, while the platform team assumes they only store logs, and nobody reviews them in a way that satisfies the baseline. Or a system team might assume the identity service enforces everything, while the identity team assumes the application team is responsible for authorization rules and role mapping. Implementing consistently means translating your control allocation decisions into operational reality by making sure each owner can actually perform their responsibilities and by ensuring the handoffs are defined. If a baseline requires monitoring and response, consistency requires that alerts are routed to an owner who responds and records outcomes. If a baseline requires configuration management, consistency requires that changes go through the expected process no matter which team makes them. A control that is split across owners must be stitched together through practice, not just through documentation. When the stitching is weak, the control looks present but fails under assessment or during incidents. Configuration drift is one of the most predictable enemies of consistent implementation because systems change constantly and small changes can quietly undo baseline protections. A baseline might expect secure configurations, but if updates reset settings or new components are deployed without the baseline configuration, the control becomes inconsistent across the system. Drift is especially common when teams treat initial hardening as the only hardening, rather than as a standard that must be applied repeatedly. Consistent implementation means treating baseline configurations as a living standard, where the expected settings are defined, applied, and checked regularly. It also means changes are deliberate, authorized, and documented so you can explain why a deviation occurred and whether it was approved as a risk decision. When drift is unmanaged, teams often discover it during an assessment, which is the worst moment to discover it because evidence and timelines become messy. When drift is managed, teams discover it through routine checks and correct it before it becomes a compliance problem. Logging and monitoring provide another clear example of what consistency looks like in practice, because it is easy to claim logs exist while missing the baseline's real intent. A baseline-aligned logging implementation is not just about collecting data, but about collecting the right data, protecting it, retaining it for the required period, and reviewing it in a way that can detect misuse or failure. Inconsistency appears when one component logs detailed security events while another logs almost nothing, or when logs are collected but not reviewed, or when retention is applied in one environment but not another. Consistent implementation means you define what events must be captured for the system, ensure coverage across components, and ensure that the review process is performed according to the defined cadence. It also means protecting logs from alteration and ensuring access to logs is controlled, because logs are both evidence and a target. When your logging approach is consistent, you can tell a coherent story. The system produces relevant events, the events are stored and protected, and the organization actively uses them to manage risk. Access control is another control area where implementation can look consistent on paper while being inconsistent in reality, especially across user populations and privileged actions. A baseline-aligned access implementation means you know who can access the system, how access is granted, what roles exist, and how access is reviewed and removed when no longer needed. Inconsistency shows up when one team follows the approval process and another team grants access informally, or when privileged access is handled like ordinary access, or when external accounts follow a different path that is not documented. Consistency requires that access rules are enforced the same way across environments and components in scope, and that exceptions are treated as exceptions, meaning they are documented, approved, and time-bounded. It also requires that role mapping is kept accurate as the system changes, because a role model that made sense at launch can become outdated as new features are added. When access practices are consistent, you reduce both security risk and compliance risk because the baseline intent is visible in day-to-day behavior. Vulnerability management is often described as a security operations topic, but it is also a key part of implementing baseline expectations consistently, because many baselines expect routine identification and remediation of weaknesses. Inconsistency shows up when scanning occurs on some components, but not others, when remediation timeframes are applied only when convenient, or when exceptions are granted informally, without clear risk ownership. A baseline-aligned vulnerability program applies the same triage logic, the same remediation expectations, and the same documentation discipline across the system scope. That does not mean every vulnerability is fixed instantly, but it does mean that decisions are consistent, transparent, and repeatable. If a vulnerability cannot be fixed quickly, the mitigation and the exception process should be consistent, including review dates and ownership. Consistent implementation also includes verifying fixes, because a claimed fix that was not validated can leave the exposure unchanged. When vulnerability management follows a consistent pattern, it becomes part of continued compliance evidence rather than an afterthought that produces surprises before audits. Documentation and evidence practices also need consistent implementation, because documentation is not a separate activity from controls. It is often how controls are proven and maintained. A baseline-aligned program ensures that control narratives, procedures, and evidence records are updated as part of operational rhythm, not only when an assessment is announced. Inconsistency appears when one control has strong evidence, like review records and approvals, while another control is described only with vague statements like "we follow best practices." Another form of inconsistency is storing evidence in inconsistent locations or formats, which makes it hard to retrieve and undermines trust. Consistent documentation practices define where evidence lives, how it is labeled, how long it is retained, and who can access it, and they ensure that evidence is produced on schedule. When documentation is consistent, it also makes onboarding easier, because new staff can understand what is expected without relying on oral tradition. A compliance baseline is only as durable as the evidence discipline that supports it over time. Training and awareness are another area where the baseline can be met inconsistently if the organization treats training as a one-time event instead of an operating requirement. Baselines often expect that people understand their roles, especially around data handling, incident reporting, and access discipline. Inconsistency shows up when some teams train thoroughly and others treat training as optional, or when new staff receive access before training, or when training content is outdated relative to current procedures. Consistent implementation means training is tied to access and responsibility, so people receive required knowledge before they are placed in positions where mistakes can cause harm. It also means refresher training occurs at the defined cadence, and when procedures change, so knowledge stays aligned with reality. Training should not be treated as theater, because theater does not change behavior. When training is consistent and relevant, it reduces mishandling and strengthens the compliance story, because it demonstrates that controls are supported by informed people, not just by technology. Change management is a practical connector across nearly all controls, because changes are when controls are most likely to be bypassed. A baseline-aligned change process is not simply having a process document. It is ensuring changes actually flow through the process, including approvals, testing where appropriate, and documentation of outcomes. Inconsistency appears when emergency changes become the norm, when changes are made by informal agreement, or when different teams follow different rules depending on urgency. Consistent implementation means defining what counts as a normal change, what counts as an urgent change, and what minimum steps still apply even when time is short. It also means ensuring that after an urgent change, documentation and review catch up so the control story stays accurate. Without consistent change discipline, controls drift, logs become unreliable, and evidence becomes fragmented. When change management is consistent, it becomes the mechanism that protects baseline intent during evolution, because the baseline is carried forward through each change rather than being left behind. A final piece of consistent implementation is measuring whether controls are operating as intended, because you can implement a control consistently in form but still fail in effect. For example, you might review logs consistently, but if reviews are rushed and no one responds to findings, the effect is weak. You might conduct access reviews consistently, but if reviews do not result in removing unneeded access, the effect is weak. You might have a vulnerability remediation process consistently, but if exceptions are granted too easily, the effect is weak. Effectiveness measures help you detect when consistency has turned into ritual rather than protection. A baseline-aligned strategy uses a small set of meaningful indicators that show whether controls are producing the intended outcomes, such as reduction in overdue vulnerabilities, consistent completion of reviews, and successful recovery tests. These measures should be used to improve processes, not to punish teams, because the goal is stronger control operation. When you link consistency with effectiveness, you avoid the trap of being compliant in paperwork, but fragile in reality. By the end of this lesson, the main idea is that implementing selected controls consistently with the chosen compliance baseline is not a one-time build task, but an operational discipline that keeps controls aligned with intent, parameters, scope, and evidence expectations over time. Consistency comes from clear parameters, deliberate handling of environment differences, standard patterns and shared services, and explicit responsibility handoffs that prevent inherited controls from turning into gaps. It also comes from managing configuration drift, enforcing change discipline, maintaining logging and access practices across the full scope, and treating vulnerability management as a routine control operation rather than a sporadic activity. Documentation and training are not side projects. They are part of what makes consistency durable and testable. When you implement this way, assessments become a review of steady behavior rather than a hunt for last-minute proof, and the baseline becomes what it was meant to be, a reliable standard that keeps protection outcomes predictable as the system grows and changes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.